With the social climate of companies supporting generative AI, representation being called woke trash, and anime constantly sexualizing characters, it's great to find an anime that stands as the antithesis to all of that. This anime exemplifies its stance by talking about the humanistic side of artistic expression, having great neurodivergent representation, and drawing its younger characters in a tasteful manner. I'm here to put you on an anime called Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken. Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken follows the story of three students, Asakasa, Kanamori, and Mizusaki, pursuing their love of anime by starting an animation club at their high school, along with both the challenges and celebrations that come from creating said animation. The anime was released in 2020, so this was before generative AI started becoming more mainstream, but many of the messages that the show conveys fundamentally supports the idea that art is inherently human. When we look at the character Asakasa, anime is a form of expression for her active imagination. We'll discuss the neurodivergent tendencies a little later in the video, but one of the key traits of her character that many neurodivergent people relate to is her immersive daydreaming, which is often represented in the anime itself by the less polished animation and drawings. And this is one of the first moments where we see how animation is fundamentally human, because this is how Asakasa shares more about herself with the other characters. In the first episode, for example, Asakasa dives into her concept art and says it's all for the purpose of the greatest world that she can imagine, and her concept art is a way to invite Mizusaki and Kanamori into her imagination. You can see this when Asakasa is trying to create a flying ship. Mizusaki and Kanamori add in their own input to its creation, like what kind of wings and cockpit it should have, and actively participate in Asakasa's fantasy of flying around and dodging enemies in a dogfight chase. If we stick with this motif where the less polished art is representative of imagination, the end of the dream sequence is one of the most important parts to highlight, because when the art becomes more polished, it signifies and shows that, to them, that world has become a reality. We cut back to Mizusaki and Asakasa simply looking at the concept art, and they both even say how they felt like they just went somewhere awesome and saw something amazing. This obviously extends to when the animation is complete for a wider audience too. When they present their first film to the school, you can see the other students being immersed in the experience as well. They feel the wind from the canyon, they see the bullet shells of the tank, they see the lasers flying out of the screen. Through art and animation, Asakasa is able to communicate her self-expression to others in a human-to-human interaction that does not exist when AI is brought into the equation. Animation is a human experience that communicates inward ideas and imagination to a human audience. But that's not all. Going with the character Mizusaki, the anime's second arc with creating an animation for the Robot Club delves even deeper into the humanistic side of creating anime. Mizusaki has always been incredibly fascinated with the fluidity of motion in everyday life, whether it be how tea flies out of a cup, how a person gets up from a chair, or the simple swaying of a model's walk. That attentiveness leads her to want to pursue animation. When discussing with her friends, from her perspective, she suggests that animation is nothing without the culmination of humanistic experiences, and she even says that, quote, anime is the best way to appreciate movement. The simple decision to create movement in the insignificant details suddenly develops more impact because a human chose to animate them. If we apply this philosophy to our current climate, this is something an AI just can't appreciate. And again, this applies even further when the movie is ready to be shared with wider audiences. After Eizouken creates the animation for the Robotics Club, Mizusaki's parents are in the theater too, and they can tell immediately how her life experiences bleed through the work that she's created. In one of the opening scenes, that moment of throwing the tea out of the cup is called back to for us, the audience, to remember, but it continues even further for Mizusaki's parents. For example, when a character runs, her parents immediately clock it and say that it's her. They discuss how she has always been great at imitating movements, dances, and even imitated her grandma when she was growing up. These are all experiences that we saw when we watched Mizusaki's backstory. They know that she always consistently analyzed how people moved and expressed her analysis and findings through animation. And they can tell from the product itself how much of her has bled through the work. And even her father says that even though he has been pushing for her to become an actor, she's already become a fine performer. Even when the three of them discuss the film together after the screening and she asks what they thought, her father mentions chopsticks, which calls back to an earlier scene in the anime where Mizusaki compares with Kanamori and Asakasa on how they hold their utensils. What's funnier is that Mizusaki knows exactly what her dad is talking about and already says, "You never told me about that," before he could even finish his sentence. But in the end, her parents say that it was some fine acting. Animation is fundamentally artistic expression. It is, again, the collection of experiences of a human brought forth for a human audience to connect with. It appreciates the little details in life. It appreciates the unique experiences of a person as they bleed through the work, and therefore, in my eyes, cannot be done justice by generative AI. So I want to bring up that in the past, in my shorts when I've discussed this anime, some people point out that they used AI in their first video project. What they're referring to is a scene where they realize they don't have enough time to hand draw all of the animation for their deadline, so they use a digital program to automatically tween the animation. Tweening is where you have the keyframes of the video and then either by hand or by computer program create the in-between frames that simulate the movement that is known as animation. I want to emphasize that the conversation the characters have about using these programs is more about digital versus hand-drawn when it comes to their animation techniques. Tweening programs like Adobe Flash have existed for a long time and often still require a lot of human oversight to use properly. Additionally, while some tweening programs like Adobe Animate use AI for some features, tweening typically uses presets of code and vector tools, as far to my knowledge, to achieve its goals. And even then, the characters are using it as a tool rather than doing the heavy lifting. Mizusaki even says herself that she'll use the tweening program only on the condition that she can focus on hand-drawn animation for the parts that she really wants to emphasize. So I bring this up mainly because I don't think the programs they're using are AI, and even if for some reason I have my information wrong and it is, they're using it as a tool rather than doing the creating. If there are people in my comments that are animators, I'd love to gain a better insight into what exactly these tweening programs consist of, but I just wanted to bring this up because many people mention this when they end up watching the anime. The next thing I want to discuss about the characters is what I mentioned earlier, that the characters are fantastic representation for neurodivergency. Something to keep in mind is that, as far as I know, I'm neurotypical. I haven't gotten myself tested or anything, so when I talk about the neurodivergent experience, it comes from reading that I've done from sources online or from the comments in my short videos. I also want people to keep in mind that neurodivergency is, like many things, a spectrum. There will be some tendencies that are more common among people, but no one single person's experience with neurodivergency is universal. This is also important in that if you feel like these experiences relate to you, it's best not to jump to conclusions, and if you have the resources, get yourself tested by a professional. That being said, this anime is one of the few cases where the author of the manga, Sumito Owara, has openly stated that these characters, especially Asakusa, are a reflection of his neurodivergent experience. For full transparency, all the information in this section I'm providing comes from translation by Google Chrome, and I'll leave a link in the description for you guys to peruse as well. But in this interview by Yomi Doctor, he opens up about his struggles with his learning disability when doing basic arithmetic, calculations involving time, and writing kanji. He also discusses that he was diagnosed with high language ability, but oftentimes when told instructions, he'll get caught up on the original meaning of the word. For example, at the train station when they say stand behind the yellow line, he can't really fully understand what that means. Does behind mean in relation to the track, to the people, somewhere along the line itself? He has a hard time understanding what exactly that means. At the end of the interview, he talks about how Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken is a story about how he gained friends through filmmaking in his high school film club, as well as a blend of other personal experiences. There's a lot more in the article itself, and I think it's a great read and very insightful in the many types of experiences a neurodivergent person might go through. As a neurotypical person, I think this article helped me gain a bit more perspective, even if just a little. And then lastly, he has also come out on these Twitter posts saying that he suffers from developmental disorders as well. The first tweet is talking about how he takes medication for his ADHD, and the second one talks about how he is on the autism spectrum. My main point is that while the characters never explicitly say that they're neurodivergent, the anime is clearly beyond the level of headcanons, with the author being very intentional on having a neurodivergent portrayal. But anyway, when we look at these characters, Asakusa especially has a lot about her that many neurodivergent people will be able to relate to. Again, I am neurotypical, so what I did was basically analyze what actions and behavior from the characters stood out to me, cross-reference those with some online reading on tendencies of neurodivergent behavior, and even looked at some opinion articles from other neurodivergent people who have also talked about this anime. I already mentioned earlier in the video that immersive daydreaming is one of her favorite pastimes, and her outlet for drawing out said imagination eventually evolved into a love of animation. You can even see in the first episode, for example, as a child how she explores and imagines different machinations around her, and then later returns home to draw out what she envisioned in her mind. And like I mentioned before, animation to her is all for the sake of the greatest world that she can imagine. We can cross-reference these moments with this Psychology Today article talking about maladaptive daydreaming within certain individuals with autism, and this article from the ABA Centers of Georgia Patricia discussing creative mediums like drawing as a means for expression, self-regulation, and communication. Speaking of, let's back up a bit and talk about how exactly Asakusa developed her love for animation in the first place. This article by Patricia Baxter, who describes herself as an autistic woman with ADHD, helps us gain a little insight into moments like how neurodivergent people gain their special interests. One night when Asakusa is home alone, she's watching cartoons wrapped up in blankets almost as a means for ASMR or self-regulation rather than entertainment. But something all of a sudden clicks for her, and now she's enraptured by the quality of animation and starts to sit closer with full attention, completely foregoing the regulating experience she was seeking earlier. According to Baxter, this moment is a combination of her finding her hyperfixation, the subject that a person focuses on intensively above all else, within animation, and it evolving into something she's highly passionate about on an incredibly intense level, which we typically label as special interests. You know what autistic people tend to do when they have a special interest? They info dump it, where they essentially almost monologue and discuss excessively and deeply on topics that they're passionate about, at least according to this article from Autism Awareness Center. When Asakusa is with Kanamori and they are watching a screening of one of her favorite anime, she starts info dumping and over-explaining why she enjoys anime, much to Kanamori's annoyance, to which we can see Asakusa's sadness and embarrassment when she gets shot down. The Autism Awareness article also talks about how info dumping can be a form of a love language, so that sadness that Asakusa expresses when she gets shot down, I presume, is a very common feeling among autistic people. The bouts in productivity that Asakusa faces throughout the anime also seem to be indicative of a combination of ADHD and autistic tendencies. Oftentimes her productivity comes in waves. She'll be doing nothing or procrastinating for a really long time, much to Kanamori's annoyance, but then she'll have a huge wave of productivity. In episode 6, for example, she presents a huge pile of storyboards for Kanamori and Mizusaki to look at, to which Kanamori simply states, "I see you're still fast when you get going." Kanamori then explains to Mizusaki that Asakusa has this ability to draw an incredible amount once she gets going, but she spends too much time not drawing otherwise. This seems to be indicative of something called the boom and bust cycle that many people with ADHD go through. According to Dr. Alice Rizzi, it could look like working 12-hour days, the boom, and then feeling completely wiped out, the bust. She goes on to explain that these are periods of hyper-focus, but without regulation, they can easily lead to burnout as well. This happens again later on in the anime too, when Kanamori is doing everything she can to get Asakusa to plot out the story for their city project, to which Asakusa just can't bring herself to do. But all of a sudden, she has everything ready without the others realizing that she had even worked on it in the first place. The bust period also brings in a combination of tendencies of autism specifically for Asakusa, where she typically seeks out some form of stimulation as a means to recharge her brain. Kanamori mentions in the same episode regarding Asakusa's huge bouts in productivity that she also needs to, quote, oxygenate her depleted brain, which leads her to interacting with nature, animals, or just simple exploration for stimulation. It's the same thing when Asakusa is supposed to be plotting out the story for the city project. She's mainly focused on exploring and seeking out inspiration through experiences, to which Kanamori doesn't really understand and views it as distractions and procrastination. Granted, sometimes Asakusa does get preoccupied by external stimuli, which you can see with this scene where Asakusa and Mizusaki easily get distracted by a tanuki, again, much to Kanamori's annoyance, but this is also an ADHD tendency, according to this research published in the National Library of Medicine. But most of the time, she just needs stimulation to go through that bust period before she can be productive again. Adding to the point of stimulation, Asakusa can find it from her possessions too. Going back to the article by Baxter, Asakusa has a little bunny that she keeps with her, usually when she's in a regulating period, which Baxter relates to as a physical sensation to help calm herself. It's an object that keeps her grounded and comfortable during times of stress and, in Asakusa's case, her burnout periods too. You can even see at the end when they're finally done with the city project how Asakusa is basically wiped out and cuddled up with that bunny yet again. One more thing I think should be noted about Asakusa is how her social interactions with people that aren't her friends usually go. For how much she loves to info dump, she has a hard time explaining and expressing herself to people she's not comfortable with. One episode that sticks out to me in particular is when Asakusa is trying to explain to the art students why the paintings that they've done for the backgrounds won't work. I think this scene in particular tries to implicate the difficulty of communication between neurodivergent and neurotypical people. For example, Asakusa notices that the sun is on the wrong side, meaning that it'd be a sunset instead of a sunrise, to which the artist says, I mean, is it really a problem? Asakusa then starts trying to explain, but then gets overwhelmed at all the other mistakes that she's catching in the backgrounds as well, like the car that's supposed to be in a cell rather than the background. The artist even says, Asakusa, you said the details were up to me, right? To which Asakusa says, yes, but with keeping the image board and the layout lines in mind. When you look back at the scene when Asakusa is actually explaining what they need from the artist, Asakusa does bring up things like don't draw the car and such, so communication clearly got misinterpreted and lost somewhere down the line. The way Asakusa first explains implies realized that the instructions she gave weren't clear enough for one of the artists to understand fully, and the artist failed to follow up with any clarifications. But what I think was even more fascinating was how Asakusa seemed nervous the entire time, pointing out the mistakes, and how the artist seemed offended at all the mistakes Asakusa pointed out. There's a theory by Dr. Damian Milton called the double empathy theory, which suggests that neurodivergent individuals are often misunderstood by neurotypicals as rude or disengaged, and neurodivergent people in turn struggle with social nuances, thus making them feel alienated. I think from Asakusa being tense and nervous during the meeting to the artist seeming to be offended puts this theory to work. There's other scenes too where clearly Asakusa is having a hard time handling the conversation, like when she tries to stand up to the student council during the budget meeting. She's clearly overwhelmed by the amount of people and loud noises occurring everywhere, and I wanted to point this out mainly because I feel that she is so brave when she puts everything in her power to stand up for herself and her club. And the last part I'll mention about this is that during her flashback when Asakusa meets Kanamori for the first time, she has a very strong sentiment that people are scary and how the school tries to force her to interact with people. But she hates the idea that she needs to fit in society and even says herself she'd rather be a hermit for the rest of her life. It's only through the bonding experiences with another non-conforming student like Kanamori and the shared special interests with Mizusaki that Asakusa truly feels like she can be herself. Speaking of, the character Mizusaki also has some characteristics that people could typically associate with neurodivergency as well. Her info dump topic is mainly when discussing body movements, which we've already covered from episode 7, and the aspects of why she's fascinated by animation because of it. Speaking of info dumping, like I mentioned earlier, while Kanamori is annoyed by Asakusa's, I feel like it's not a coincidence that Mizusaki overheard Asakusa and took that as an opportunity to become fast friends with her because she realized that they had a shared special interest. That being said too, it's interesting because she's very calm and professional around fans and strangers, but her true quirky imaginative personality gets shown when she's with Eizouken. I've read that this is something called masking, where neurodivergent people will change and adapt their behaviors based on the social expectations of the people they are interacting with. So it makes sense for Mizusaki to keep one up around fans and be less attentive to it when she's with her like-minded friends. There are other little things that Mizusaki does similarly to Asakusa, but the other big thing that I noticed is that she spends a lot of time playing around with the repetitive movements that she wants to animate, like the swordplay in the first animation. I want to say that this is a form of stimming as well, since Mizusaki is doing this quite often in an environment where it's very work-focused. I can't help but think her meticulous nature surrounding it involves stimming at least slightly. And then finally on the neurodivergency topic, I know I've been talking about this for quite a while, so I appreciate if you're still with me, by the way. When we discuss Kanamori, it's one of those cases where I'm not really sure simply because I don't see a lot of people online talking about her behavior. She discusses how money is a tangible result of hard work, so I wonder if that's like a visual aid or visual support to Kanamori on her productivity. Visual aids include like boards or task cards or schedules to keep things on track, but that's not necessarily exclusive to neurodivergent people either. Regardless, I do think it was something interesting to bring up, and if you feel like there's something to be said about Kanamori's desire to visually see her productivity, her tendency to boss around people when they're not on schedule, and be very particular about budgets, please let me know in the comments. And the last thing I want to mention about the anime is that the character designs are fantastic for one simple thing. The high school girls are drawn like high school girls, not fully developed adults that have been shrunken down in size. Anime often feels really weird because they'll make characters like 14 or something with fully developed adult features. I'm looking at you, Yoko from Gurren Lagann, but I truly appreciate Eizouken because they're clearly kids. They're just little gremlins that are going through different stages of puberty. And the characters are treated so tastefully the entire time too. Not a single upskirt shot, no fan service, no nothing. On top of that, there's a decent amount of black characters in speaking roles too. And like the other characters, they're designed really well. There's Parker from the audio club that helps Eizouken with the sound design on their works. And then there's Sowande, who's kind of a villain who's doing her job mainly as a secretary for the student council. Out of like the 5 students that have regular speaking roles across multiple episodes, that's like 40%, which is pretty good in my opinion. However, when discussing these characters' designs, there is an elephant in the room, a controversy surrounding Sumito Owara. Back in 2020, around the time the anime had already come out, people discovered that on his Pixiv account, Owara was following a number of artists that had 3D suggestive art of lolicon. There was enough of a backlash for Owara to make a statement about it, and his reasoning for following these accounts was that he liked the materials as reference, and that overall he was confused in being certified as a pedophile from abroad. Now, Owara has stopped following them, but thanks to this post on Tumblr that brought up the situation, I was able to find 2 of the accounts in question. In my opinion, I'll tell you from what I saw, it's pretty gross. Like, I really don't buy the references excuse, mostly because following the accounts is high-key really weird anyway, even if they are for good references. But here's the thing. Owara's work as it stands right now does not reflect these types of depictions at all. If you watch something like Black Butler, for example, Yana Toboso has been known to draw Shotokan art in the past, and you can definitely feel that vibe in the work, but with Owara, I don't get lolicon vibes while watching Eizouken. In fact, there's a whole bathhouse scene with the characters, but it's not gratuitous at all. Like I said, the characters are drawn tastefully, and it's literally just them being in a bathhouse hanging out. There's nothing inherently sexual about the display being shown. I feel like that's really rare to find an anime which so often depicts minors in perverted situations. Since the work itself doesn't really reflect anything gross that may be coming from the author, I think this is a rare situation where you can genuinely separate the art from the artist. In my humble opinion, you shouldn't let the morality of the author, whatever it may be, ruin your experience of watching the anime. I want to reiterate that I'm not defending the author for looking at that stuff. I'm just saying the anime does not reflect what he views at all. If on your personal moral compass you still can't find it in you to watch the anime, I totally understand. Since there's nothing suggestive in the work, I think we have the rare luxury of being able to separate the art and the artist, and I think it's important to note that we can appreciate Eizouken as a work without putting the author on a pedestal. While I do think that finding creators that aren't problematic is very valuable, I also feel like it's really rare, and so I would say like 98% of the time, you shouldn't deter yourself from enjoying a work just because of its creator. Just giving some examples for myself, Saban, the creator of Power Rangers, one of my favorite franchises, supports Israel. SNK, the creators of my favorite fighting game, King of Fighters, is owned by the Saudi Arabian government, which commits crimes against women all the time. And then Eiichiro Oda, the creator of One Piece, glazes Nobuhiro Watsuki all the time, who got charged with child porn possession, so there you go. It's important to acknowledge when creators are problematic, but if you're actively avoiding every work from a problematic creator, I think that just makes things really difficult. And if this is a situation where you don't want to financially support the creator, then I'm sure the Straw Hats can help you with that too. But I think this topic is a very complicated and nuanced situation, so if you have a different opinion, then I'd love to hear it. But that's Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken, the anti-AI, neurodivergent, non-sexualizing children anime that I would recommend to everyone. In a world where AI is starting to become the norm in the artistic sphere, it's really nice to see an anime that appreciates the humanistic side of art. When involving representation, I love how this anime portrays kids, how it portrays black characters, and that this is one of the few instances where you can say, no, it's not headcanon, these are neurodivergent characters. Thank you so much guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, hit the bell icon. I don't think I forgot anything. I will try to post more videos throughout this year that are long form, so I hope you'll stick around for that. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys on the next anime topic.